In March of 2021, Rogers Communications announced the purchase of Shaw Communications for $26 billion, the biggest deal in Canadian telecom history. More than a year later, the deal is still waiting on some key regulatory approvals, and then on July 8th, 2022, this happened.
No mobile or internet service for Rogers customers today, and no real explanation as to why.
Everyone's like walking around like the sky is falling and everything's being ruined, like, and what's going on? Oh, the internet and the Wi-Fi and all that's down.
You can't phone anybody, you can't pay anything with debit.
Needless to say, this is bad. If you want this acquisition to go through, this is one of the worst possible things that could have happened, especially when there's so much regulatory uncertainty surrounding the deal in the first place. So what led to this deal between Rogers and Shaw, what's holding it up, and where could it go from here? To understand what led to this proposed purchase, let's take a look back at how these companies got started and how they've interacted with one another up until now. And full disclosure, at the time of making this video I hold shares of Shaw Communications, but I'll be looking at this deal from an objective standpoint. Our story begins with Rogers, which started in 1960 when it purchased Toronto radio station CHFI-FM. In 1967, it co-founded Rogers Cable alongside the company that more or less was the predecessor to today's Bell Media. By 1971, the CRTC had new rules, and one of those rules made it so that the company known as BARB had to sell their share of Rogers Cable. While this gave Rogers 100% ownership, the company was pushed to its budgetary limits. Despite the financial strain, the growth of the company managed to outpace its debts, and by 1979, Rogers made some big moves. In January, it paid $35 million to buy 50.01% of Canadian Cablesystems, which was Canada's second largest cable system, expanding its footprint in Toronto and other parts of southern Ontario and gaining a listing on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And then, in December, it announced the purchase of Premier Cablevision for $42.5 million, adding subscribers in Vancouver, Ontario, and Ireland. The Irish cable system would be sold in the mid-1980s. These acquisitions took Rogers from being the sixth largest cable operator in Canada to the largest, and from 600,000 subscribers to more than 2 million subscribers by 1982. Even back in those days, founder Ted Rogers wanted to build a national cable system. Rogers' rapid expansion was precipitated by looming competition. In 1978, having just launched their first fiber optic network, Bell was setting their sights on either becoming a direct competitor or replacing existing cable systems altogether. Rogers was, quite understandably, not cool with this. In the early 1980s, Rogers would be one of the co-founders of a company called Cantel, which would launch Canada's first national cell phone service in July 1985. Rogers would go on to buy out the stakes held by the other three partners in the business, and the company was eventually renamed Rogers Wireless. As an aside, if you want to know more about the history of Rogers Communications and how it became a big player in these different industries, I recommend reading Highwire Act, Ted Rogers and the Empire That Debt Built by Caroline Van Hasselt. I'll link it in the description if you want to check it out. Meanwhile, the roots of Shaw take us to the other side of Ontario, and not as a cable business, but a construction company. Over the years, the company would move into services for oil and gas pipelines, including pipeline coatings, wire and cable products, and eventually cable television. By the way, this former parent company is still around today, though now it's known as Shawcor. Its cable-providing subsidiary, Capital Cable Television Company Limited, was founded in 1966 and would connect its first customers in Sherwood Park, Alberta in 1971. At some point in the 1970s, Capital Cable spun off from its parent company, and in 1983, with a brand new listing on the TSX, it changed its name to Shaw Cablesystems. Fast forward to 1994. There's a Canadian company called Maclean Hunter that both Rogers and Shaw are thinking about buying. It holds cable systems in a bunch of key markets in southern Ontario, and it's also the founder of Maclean's magazine and the Financial Post, among a bunch of other holdings. Rogers goes for it, but before they do, they call up Shaw, now the third largest cable provider in Canada, and cut a deal that would see both companies begin to regionally organize their scattered cable systems. If Rogers' purchase of Maclean Hunter went through, Shaw, based in Edmonton, would get Rogers' existing systems in Calgary and Victoria, Maclean Hunter's systems in Sault Ste. Marie and Thunder Bay, and Toronto area radio station CFNY-FM, which is now known as 102.1 The Edge. In exchange, Rogers would get some cash and Shaw's systems in parts of Toronto and 4 southwestern Ontario markets. And the CRTC said yes, so they made the trade. But a year later, Shaw would return to the GTA by buying up Classicom and CUC Broadcasting, which each held cable systems across southern Ontario. These deals would add a combined 522,000 subscribers, and make Shaw the second largest cable provider in Canada, behind only Rogers. In 2000, Shaw and Rogers announced another trade, with Rogers swapping its BC cable systems, including Vancouver, in exchange for Shaw's Southern Ontario and New Brunswick cable systems. By this point, the divide between the two largest players in Canadian cable was clear. Shaw focused on the West, and Rogers focused on the East. But in 2009, when an opportunity came up to buy Hamilton's Mountain Cablevision, Shaw went for it, and Rogers said, "Hey, what? No!" So they filed a lawsuit alleging there had been a non-compete agreement in place since the swap in 2000, and that Shaw was breaking it by making an acquisition beyond its Northern Ontario border. Shaw denied this, and questioned whether such an agreement would even be legal in the first place. Ontario's Superior Court ruled in favor of Shaw, the CRTC approved Shaw's purchase, and Shaw was back in Southern Ontario. At least for a few years. This is because Shaw would sell that cable system to Rogers in 2013, along with wireless spectrum in Western Canada that it purchased in 2008. In 2015, Shaw would enter the wireless business, announcing its purchase of Wind Mobile, the fourth largest wireless carrier in Canada, later changing the name to Freedom Mobile. In fall 2020, Shaw realized it was in a tough spot. Its speeds and prices were beginning to lag behind its biggest competitor, TELUS, which was chipping away at Shaw's market share. When Shaw crunched the numbers to figure out what it would cost to continue upgrading its networks while further expanding Freedom Mobile out east, they found it would cost billions of dollars beyond what Shaw could afford. After considering several different scenarios, in January 2021, Shaw and Rogers representatives met at an airplane hangar in Calgary to confidentially begin talks of a potential deal. And that leads us to March 15th, 2021.
The blockbuster deal between two telecom giants worth billions.
Rogers and Shaw have finally agreed to tie the knot. There's been speculation for years.
We'll see very shortly how Bay Street responds.
Rogers announces its purchase, subject to regulatory approval, of Shaw Communications for $26 billion, which includes $6 billion of Shaw's debt. This deal going through would see Rogers leapfrog past TELUS as Canada's second largest telecom company. Shaw shareholders would receive $40.50 Canadian cash for each Shaw share that they held. Rogers has said that as part of this deal, they'll invest $500 million a year for the next 5 years to upgrade 5G networks, $1 billion to improve connectivity in rural, remote, and indigenous communities, and $3 billion toward its network, services, and technology. This announcement saw Shaw shares skyrocket by nearly $10 over the previous day's close, and with that 41.6% jump, it briefly reached a new 52-week high. Rogers shares also went up, but by a more modest 3.56%. But a deal of this magnitude couldn't just happen. There needed to be a whole bunch of approvals, starting with the Shaw shareholders, and the shareholders said yes. Well, 99.8% of them did. Next, it went to the Court of Queen's Bench of Alberta, and the court said yes. Then there was a hearing in front of the CRTC, and the CRTC said yes, which meant 2 approvals remained. The Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development said, the wholesale transfer of Shaw's wireless licenses to Rogers is fundamentally incompatible with our government's policies for spectrum and mobile service competition, and I will simply not permit it. Which basically means they're just not okay with that one piece of the deal. If that's changed or amended, then we'll see what they say about a full approval or denial. And lastly, there's the Competition Bureau, which has arguably been the biggest hurdle of all to clear so far. And the Competition Bureau said, no. Looking at this proposal, it's clear what's holding this up. There is no overlap between Rogers and Shaw's cable systems. It's not as though buying Shaw takes a competitor off the table when it comes to TV or internet service. It just means that in Western Canada and parts of Northwestern Ontario, Rogers just takes over the spot that Shaw used to have. But on the wireless side, now that's what the government and Competition Bureau are concerned about. Look at this chart. Look at how many countries pay a third of what we pay for cell phone service. Even in the United States, which is still comparatively more expensive than the vast majority of the other countries shown here, their rate is still a third cheaper than ours. Over the years, we've seen new players enter the market, but then one of the existing providers just buys them out anyway. That's what the government and what the Competition Bureau want to avoid here. It took a lot just to get a fourth player in the wireless space, not even one that's fully available nationwide at that. And so they don't want Rogers absorbing Freedom Mobile. Rogers is already the largest wireless carrier in Canada, so this would be that same scenario all over again. So Rogers and Shaw addressed this by announcing their intention to sell Freedom Mobile to Videotron, a subsidiary of Quebecor. Videotron is the largest cable provider in Quebec. They offer cell phone service as Videotron and through their own flanker brand Fizz Mobile, and they've been buying up spectrum to try and expand and eventually become a nationwide provider. When Videotron bought 294 blocks of spectrum in 2021, more than half of them were outside of Quebec. Not only that, but Videotron also recently purchased VMedia, a reseller of internet and other communication services. It looks like a serious bid on their part to try and shake things up in places where Rogers, Bell, and Telus are the only three major providers in town. So the mediation process between Shaw, Rogers, and the Competition Bureau began, but those talks didn't reach a conclusion, and then
millions of Canadians don't have access to the internet or cell phone service. A massive outage is affecting a number of Rogers services across the country.
For more than 15 hours that day, if you had a Rogers cell phone and were in an emergency, you couldn't call 911. If you used your debit card to pay for your everyday expenses, no matter where you were in Canada, you couldn't. The entire Interact system was down. And if you were looking forward to seeing The Weeknd perform in Toronto that weekend, you couldn't, because even the doors to the venue couldn't open because they were connected to the network. Rogers identified the cause of the outage as a maintenance update that went wrong, and said they would credit customers for 5 days of service. As you can imagine, this event sent Rogers and Shaw shares downward. And the government said, "Hey telecoms, all of you have 60 days to work together to figure out some kind of backup plan to help one another so that this doesn't happen ever again." On October 25th, just before mediation with the Competition Bureau was scheduled to begin, Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne released a statement formally denying the original transaction and placing 2 new conditions on any potential deal. Number 1, Videotron would have to hold on to the wireless licenses it gains for a minimum 10 years. No selling, no flipping allowed during that time. And number 2, Videotron would have to bring its prices for Western Canada and Ontario down by around 20%, bringing them closer to its prices in Quebec. And Quebecor said yes. But on October 27th, despite mediation talks with the Competition Bureau earlier that day, Rogers, Shaw, and Quebecor said they couldn't reach a settlement. Formal public hearings with the Competition Tribunal are set to begin on November 7th and could extend as long as December 8th. If the Competition Tribunal says no to the deal, the next step for Rogers could be to look to the federal court to review the deal. And if Rogers calls off the acquisition, they'd have to pay a $1.5 billion breakup fee to Shaw. If the Competition Tribunal says yes, or the Competition Bureau reaches an agreement with Rogers and Shaw beforehand, all that remains is an approval from the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. At the time of this video, the final date of the transaction is December 31st, and under the current agreement, that can potentially be extended to January 31st, 2023. Mayor Yagi, an analyst with Scotiabank, thinks the possibility of the deal going through is at 90%, and that the new terms are conducive to further negotiations, though he does caution that it may take until summer of 2023 for a decision to be reached. And the sentiment from other analysts, at least prior to the mediation talks, still seems generally positive that the deal will go through in some form. However, the most recent update suggests that the Competition Bureau, Rogers, and Shaw aren't at all on the same page. The Competition Bureau still wants a full block of the deal as it stood back in May, while Rogers and Shaw are disputing that. Because Freedom Mobile would be sold off before the merger occurs, they're saying, you have to take this wireless sale into account, it's no longer the same deal. Mayor Yagi has since said that this could mean the Competition Bureau is putting some importance on how Shaw's wireless business relies on its existing wireline business, the TV, internet, and phone service through cable. So that's where we're at right now, but I'm curious to know your thoughts on this deal and whether or not you think it will go through eventually. Let me know in the comments below. Before we go, please note I am not a financial advisor, and this video is for information and entertainment purposes only. The information in this video might be outdated or inaccurate. Always do your own due diligence or seek the advice of a licensed financial professional. Thank you so much for watching, happy dividend gardening, and we'll see you in the next video.